Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you for sticking around after the break. That's very good. Hopefully, I will be able to provide some natural solutions for those who live along the shoreline to complement our previous two speakers. So, as we all know, there's many different types of shoreline along Lake Huron. We often think that sand beaches and dunes are the first thing that pops to mind when we think of Lake Huron, but in actuality, on our whole lake, they only make up 2 to 3% of the whole shoreline. So we have cobble beaches and bedrock shores make up the majority, and coastal wetlands to the north. And of course, the bluffs to the south. So as already touched upon, we've had quite the wild ride for lake levels, and this year is another peak. We had an extended period of low levels between 2000 and 2013, which if you're a relative newcomer to the lake, might kind of skew your perception of the current lake levels. So for me, I'm 5th generation cottage owner in Tobermory. So I've been kicking around there since the late 80s. And as you can see with our boathouse, in the 1950s, we had water, 1990, not so much. And then 2 years ago, we had water again. And if you compare that 1950 and 1990, you see here, 50s was high and 90s was low. So this wild ride is very normal for Lake Huron. With the Coastal Centre, we're really lucky we get to speak to so many amazing shoreline landowners, but our number one question is, how can I protect my shoreline? And that usually falls into, where can I find an engineer to build a wall? Or how can I build a wall on my property? So there's many different ways that you can harden a shoreline or use natural infrastructure to protect your shoreline. So we have gray options and green options. The gray options are these traditional hardened shorelines. We see often in Lambton County the groins that stick out perpendicular to the shore, walls, breakwaters. And then we have gray-green. This is kind of a combination where we could have living shorelines on rock revetments, artificial reefs, and then our natural versions of the shoreline, which include dunes and natural wetlands. So here's some examples of hardened shorelines. This is a groin, a seawall, and this is a gabion basket. That's one of those baskets full of rocks. A gray-green option, this is an example of a rock revetment. And as you can see, there's a little bit of dune at the front of the rock revetment, which plays into that gray-green infrastructure. And then here you have a very beautiful home with a large dune and a winding pathway in front of it. So dunes provide many benefits, also called ecosystem services. So not just about protecting the infrastructure, but for many other things. So what are ecosystem services? They are services that are provided by ecosystems naturally that we might often have to pay for in a gray option. So these could be things like air quality regulation, water purification. So a natural wetland provides water purification, whereas we would have to have that in a water treatment plant. So this is the kind of analysis we're looking at. So for example, the ecosystem services provided of a dune include $3,000 per linear meter just of shore protection alone. That doesn't include the filtering water aspects, the habitat, preventing sand drifting onto roads or parking lots, or even the habitat, soil formation, and erosion control that it provides. We've also learned recently that if you're looking to abate your carbon footprint, you can have a dune do that for you as well. There's been some study into dunes holding carbon up to 1.12 pounds per meter per year. So we all know that forests hold carbon, dunes do as well. So types of hardened shorelines that we see typically on the southeastern shores between Sarnia and Tobermory include groins. Those are hardened shorelines that run perpendicular and are typically made of sheet steel. Metal walls, which run perpendicular, and armor stone. Those are usually those big concrete blocks. From what I'm hearing from our lakeshore landowners, armor stones are the most common thing going in right now. Small breakwaters, this is down in Rotary Cove, these little jetties. Riprap revetments, they're more kind of unusual piles of rocks versus concrete blocks. Perpendicular jetties, So this is capturing sand on the wayward side of the jetty. And this is also a gray-green option because there's vegetation incorporated. That means that it's permeable, so vegetation is able to take root. And lastly, break walls, and these are structures that are out into the nearshore waters. So as Pete talked about with hardening prevalence on Lake Erie, the Coastal Centre put out the Lake Huron Coastal Action Plan, and it just launched in December of last year. And we looked at how many shoreline hardening structures, like the ones I just discussed, existed on the shoreline between Sarnia and Tobermory. And what this map shows is the dark red areas are one structure every 0 to 2 kilometers. In some cases, they're within 30 to 40 meters of each other, up to the green areas that are one structure every greater than 6 kilometers. So we have quite a hardened shoreline just based off of our analysis through our GIS mapping. So why isn't hardening ideal? There's a lot of different reasons. The first is from a biodiversity perspective. Studies have shown that the biodiversity with shorelines that have seawalls is 23% lower than that of natural shorelines, and total organism abundance is 45% lower. So that means how many plant species versus how many fish species versus how many insect species. And they've shown that there's no difference in biodiversity on riprap environments. Those are the big rocks versus natural shorelines, but an alteration in the type of flora present. So it might reduce habitat for certain species over others. So hardening also changes the way our coastal processes work. For example, we have this longshore transport of sand and sediment that was talked about in the first two presentations. It often flows from Sault Ste. Marie down to Sarnia and curves around the shoreline in this way, generally, on the big scale. And when we have hardened shorelines, it changes the way that the sediment moves. So I created these diagrams because I'm a very visual person. I usually draw diagrams for people in the office, and it makes this whole messy thing, so I tried to make them a little easier to understand. This is a cross-section of a beach. So when we have waves coming up the beach and down the beach, this is natural wave energy movement. So it comes up the beach, and then it ripples off and comes down. When we have a rock-style revetment, it goes up, the wave energy halts at the rocks, some of it dissipates through the rock, and then carries on. If you have a wall, the energy stops. So if you think about you're driving a car and the aerodynamics of that car, the wind doesn't just stop at your car and then end, it goes around the car. And that's what happens with wave energy. The wave energy doesn't stop at the wall, it gets diverted out and down towards the lake bottom. So often with walls, we see that they become undermined and begin tipping into the lake, or they start eroding out to the sides, like on an aerial version I'll show in a minute. And the sediment back here will start eroding out, also undermining the structure. So on a healthy shoreline, we have the wave energy coming up and dissipating, going side to side. Those dunes might take some abuse, but they will come back and rebuild during times of low levels. If we have a groin, this guy has decided to put a groin in, which is very helpful for him. His beach is going to start building up again. And as we can see in this aerial image, all these folks are very happy. But unfortunately, the homeowner on the lee side is having expedited erosion. And we see this happening in the aerial image to the bottom of the screen. In the case of that sheet pile wall, we're seeing that wave energy get dissipated to the sides, and now it's affecting both landowners. And from the 80s, we've actually seen a lot of litigation suits where these landowners who have had expedited erosion are now trying to fight the destruction of their property with the landowner who installed the shoreline hardening structure. So this is an example from 1986, that owners of groins may be liable for the damage to downdrift property, a common cause of litigation. And we're seeing this now as well. This is becoming more popular. CAs are seeing this across the shoreline. So from a maintenance liability perspective, you can't just install a groin or a hardened shoreline, like an armor stone wall, and then walk away. You have to put yearly maintenance into it to keep it up. And if you don't have that maintenance going into it, then this can also be a case of liability where somebody could be walking their dog and their dog gets caught in there, and then we have a liability on our hands. So why else is hardening not ideal? This is the fluff. This is like not scientifically based, but we've seen that the number one reason why people enjoy coming to Lake Huron or are at Lake Huron is to use the shore, to walk their dogs so their grandkids can play on the shoreline. They want to protect it for the memories that they have coming to Lake Huron. And if you have a shoreline that looks like this, it's very hard to accomplish those things, even though their best interest is to protect their property. So, touching on the effects of climate change from a larger scale level, armor stone is predicted to have more rapid disintegration based on the frequency of freezing and thawing levels. Coastal wetlands may become more difficult to restore if water levels remain low because they won't have that fluctuation of water level, which a lot of species rely on. And then, of course, armoring, more challenging with more frequent and intense storm wave events. So the best time to harden your shoreline isn't while the storm is happening, it's before. But if we're having a higher lake level more consistently, that gives your window of opportunity to be smaller. So a cost comparison. So these are actual real life examples that have come across my desk in the past 3 months. To harden your shore with armor stone, the installation cost alone is $1,200 per meter. So on a 22-meter property, which is average for the southeastern shores, that's $26,000, and a 5% maintenance cost per year is an added $1,300 a year that you're going to put into that structure. These structures have also been known to have a lifespan of 15 to 25 years. So if you are trying to protect your shoreline because your son or daughter is inheriting it, you're also putting that burden onto them, saying in 15 years from now, you have to be prepared to make that investment again. For dune creation, the installation cost is $8 a meter, and that is, it's more sweat equity, but the cost of $8 a meter is for sand fencing and the T-posts to put in the ground to help catch that sand during the winter months, and the dune grass is free. So on a 22-meter property, you're looking at $176, and the lifespan is indefinite of that dune. So what are the options? We recommend that dunes be at least 6 to 10 meters wide on private property with a winding path across dunes. So of course, this image on the bottom left hand of the screen is like your ideal property on Lake Huron, but we understand that in a lot of areas on Lake Huron's shoreline, the cottage is more here, much closer to the water's edge, and there's less opportunity for mature dunes to form. So this is an example where the majority of neighbors are maintaining a very healthy, wide dune that very closely mimics the ideal situation. In this middle image, we have about 25% of the landowners that are maintaining a strong dune. And then at the bottom, none of these landowners are maintaining a strong dune. So if we think back to the last two presentations, talking about wave uprush, if you have a healthy dune, there's a greater buffer zone here for wave action than here. And
would you rather questions at the end, or?
Maybe, yes. So options on bluff and gully environments are very challenging, but for the most part, it's agricultural land. All the science recommends a 100-meter vegetated buffer. That's not a development buffer, that's just vegetation against the bluff or gully. This buffer here is not enough to prevent erosion. For wetland environments, firstly, understanding provincial and federal regulations around coastal wetlands, because a lot of them have great amounts of protection associated with them. But for wetland environments that are very shallow fens like this one, compaction from vehicles can be extremely detrimental to the soil profile. So keeping it vegetated, avoiding vehicle use on soft soil, and keeping structures off coastal wetlands is important. And in some cases, like up near Oliphant, where people have cottages on islands, during low levels they'll drive their vehicles out to the island and back, which is okay because they can't get their boat out, but having a designated path to reduce the overall impact would be a strategy around that. So in a lot of the wetland environments on Lake Huron, we see dredging for recreational purposes, which is understandable because you want to be able to use the shoreline, but at the same time it's extremely detrimental to sensitive coastal wetland habitats. So limiting the amount that it occurs across the shoreline is a good way around that. And then here's an example in a bedrock environment where people have built these little rock jetties that come out from their property. And this type of structure doesn't look super damaging, but it actually greatly affects fish spawning habitat and fish feeding habitat. So pole docks and cantilever options are preferred over crib docks and structures like this. And in some cases, like in Fathom 5 National Marine Park, you need to have a permit to put in any sort of dock, which a lot of people aren't aware of. Oh, and I should mention too, that any in-water work would also require a DFO and MNRF permit. So in woodland environments, we often see people have a beautiful row of trees between their cottage and the lake, and people want to cut the trees back so that they can see the horizon and see the beautiful shore. This is my family's cottage, and we have cut a little viewpoint, a little visage, so the chichimon actually comes in here. So in the morning we can sit out on our deck, we can see the chichimon, but they can't see us. So it's a way of doing a strategic pruning project so you have the visibility and you have the protection from storm elements and the privacy. So it takes time. Often we talk to landowners about rebuilding their dunes and planting vegetation, and during times like right now where everyone's very stressed about the current situation, they think, well, if I plant grass now, it's not going to protect me for this next year. And you're right. Rebuilding dunes takes time. This image at the bottom left shows year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. It builds up over time, and we've seen this with King Harden's dunes as well. We wouldn't expect a tree to grow to maturity overnight, and we can't expect this of dunes either. So this is an example of your beautiful beach, and just in 16 years, how much it's changed. This is an example of Grand Bend Beach, and again, you see in 2010, when they started building their dunes, there's not a lot of vegetation happening, and this is a winter shot, and the vegetation has built in quite nicely, just over 9 years, but it's better than it was before. And they're still putting in the sand fencing in the winter months to help capture sand. So the other thing that we often hear from people about dunes is, well, I had a beautiful dune and the lake took it all away this year. So, it didn't do its job. But in actuality, they're meant to be sacrificial. So this image shows that there's a dune before the storm takes out the dune, and then after the storm, that dune begins rebuilding. And this is normal. So when somebody tells me, my dune didn't work because it's gone now, I think the dune did exactly what it was meant to do, and it will come back if you let it. So in all the scientific information from coastal engineers to the little coastal scientists like me, we all agree that gray options are the option of last resort. There's lots of hoops that help us prevent hardened shoreline from going in on private property. In your area, there's Conservation Authority regulations. Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation just voted in their Environment Office to require an approval from them to put in a hardened shoreline. That's new just in the past 2 weeks. Municipal bylaws and regulations must coincide, so if there's work being done on the shoreline, there might be a bylaw against having vehicles on the shoreline. It's different for every municipality. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of consistency across municipal bylaws in this regard. The Ministry of Natural Resource and Forestry, nearshore permits, Fathom 5 National Marine Park, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and in some cases, if you're within a cottage community group, you have to bring this to the cottage association and have them approve it as well. And then after all those hoops have been jumped through, you can get an engineer, contractor, and sometimes a lawyer. And We're hearing that this is taking between 2 and 3 years to complete this process. By that point, we might not be in a situation of such high levels.
Because you may not have cottage.
Yeah.
Regulations.
So the Coastal Centre has been around since 1998, and all of our predecessors have created an immense library of resources that we have available for free on our website, lakehuron.ca. Some of them are specifically tailored to your region, like the Kincardine Coastal Stewardship Plan, which I think was made in 2011, and the Beach and Dune Guidance Manual for Saugeen Shores. And we have also put out a few more since then. They're all on the website, available for free. We also put out our Coastal Action Plan for the southeastern shores of Lake Huron in December. That was my baby. I worked on it for 3 years, and it was the first plan ever done towards best management practices on the southeastern shores. So that's a great resource. So in summary, we always want to consider natural methods first because of the cost alone, the ecosystem services that they provide, like habitat, and the hoops you'll have to jump through and the maintenance costs associated. It's important to be aware of your situation. So coming out to a night like tonight is a great first step if this is your first step. Understanding your unique situation on your property is really important, and then educating yourself about the risks and being realistic. So don't pour money into a bottomless bag. It's a hard thing to grasp. I know that with my family cottage, when they put out the flood mapping, the 100-year flood line came up to our back step, like into our basement. But we're not doing any action to prevent that, but we're understanding the risk. We've moved our septic tank to the other side of our property, so it's no longer in the risk zone. It's those little steps that you can take. And being brave. So often in our society, it is ludicrous to think that some grass and sand is going to protect your cottage better than an iron wall. But I promise you, we have so many examples to show that it does. Putting faith in natural infrastructure is a brave, brave decision. And remember why you're at the lake. So before you decide to go ahead with any kind of shoreline hardening, understand why you're there and think about how the choices that you're making will reflect the choices that will need to be made by your children and your grandchildren. Lastly, before I open it up to questions, I wanted to do a shameless pitch that the Coastal Centre is putting on our biennial conference this year in May. And we're going to have 2 days of amazing speakers that are going to be talking about everything from microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes to species at risk and topics surrounding shoreline erosion. So if this evening has been of interest to you, I highly encourage you to look up our conference. It's on our website, lakehuron.ca.
It's only $175.
Yes. Thank you.